Goodness gracious. The introductions today. Gina Walker, I'm taking you with me wherever I go. You just made me a rich man. Yeah. Well, it's always an honor to be invited to come here and speak and be a part of your Sunday mornings in this sacred space. There's a lot of thin places in the world. That's what the Celtic tradition calls them, the thin places, where the membrane between the transcendent and the mundane is so thin that you feel it coming through. And this is one of those rooms. And it's not because of the physical room. It's because of the spirits of the people that come in here. You do this, and it's such a thrill to be asked to be a small part of that. So thank you very, very much. Sometimes when I'm on a plane, and I'm asked by a stranger, so what do you do? And I tell them what I do, that I'm a philosophy professor. I teach comparative religion and mythology, and I write and I teach all over the place about all that stuff. And sometimes they say, do you believe in God? Why does that feel hostile? I don't know. It's like I'm being tested. And being a philosophy professor, of course, I answer with a question. I say, well, what do you mean by God? And then it's on, right? And then 12 hours later, you land in London exhausted. But before I am going to either assent or dissent from your concept of God, I really do need to know, what do you mean by God? Because there's so many possibilities there. I can't just say yes or no. That would be crazy. So Joseph Campbell put it this way: God is a thought. God is an idea. But its reference is to something that transcends all thinking. And the ultimate mystery of being, beyond all thoughts and forms, beyond even the concepts of being and non-being, gets clothed in language, gets clothed in concepts, and most often, most frequently, by that little three-letter word, God. But all thinking about God is necessarily metaphorical. And metaphor is a key concept in literature, in mythology, in religious studies. A metaphor, just to take you back to 8th grade English class for a second, a metaphor comes from two Greek words, meta meaning above, and pheron meaning to carry. And so when you make a metaphor, you are putting a familiar idea up over on top of an unfamiliar idea in order to illuminate something about that unfamiliar idea that's hard to talk about. So for example, when Jesus calls God Abba in his native language, Abba meaning kind of a colloquial term for dad or daddy or father, he is making a metaphor. He doesn't mean literally that God is his father, although I guess in the story of Christianity that's true. But you know what I mean. We take the father idea, which is a familiar idea to us, and we place it up over an unfamiliar idea. That's called a metaphor. We do it all the time, especially in religion. So the word God is a placeholder. And more of us, more and more Americans are thinking differently about God. In my business in religious studies, in the academic study of religion, there's a very fast-growing demographic called SBNRs. There's a bunch of them in here. SBNRs, spiritual but not religious. If you've ever defined yourself, well, I'm spiritual but I'm not religious. Well, there's a lot of things that means, but that's a growing demographic in American religious studies. One of the things it means is that people are no longer in their faith family of origin. They grew up Methodist, but now they're maybe here or somewhere else. Spiritual but not religious folks tend to say overwhelmingly that they believe in God, but they no longer think of God as someone somewhere, but rather as the name of the vibrant energy field, the ground of being itself. So to flip Lao Tzu's famous opening line of the Tao Te Ching, the God that can be told is not the real God. The God that can be named is not the eternal God. Or as the great writer and teacher Alan Watts put it, the menu is not the food. You don't come into a restaurant hungry, read the menu, and leave satisfied. The map is not the place. You don't put a map of Hawaii around your head with a rubber band and go, I'm in Hawaii now. That's confusing. That's confusing the referent with that to which it refers. It's purely cognitive error. We forget that we're using metaphors, and we fall in love with that surface name or form. And again, Joseph Campbell, I think, really helpfully describes all of our God concepts, all of our God ideas. He calls them the masks of eternity. That we conceptualize the divine, we give it a face, we give it a set of qualities, a set of characteristics, a name, and we hang that mask on the infinite. And then we forget that we made the mask. That God is not the mask. That God is the formless mystery which the mask ultimately hides from us. And that's, in many ways, the great challenge in deepening into all of our spiritual practices, to come increasingly into awareness about that confusion. And this is why mythology is so important, Campbell argues, because myth is that field of signs and symbols and stories and images that express in metaphorical form that field of reality which cannot be expressed in concepts and language. We need metaphors, we need myths. It's the only tool we have to talk about that which cannot be talked about. And this is also, Campbell argues, this is also why reading myth literally is so destructive. Because when you read myth literally, you destroy its meaning. Campbell writes, it's never difficult to show that as science, history, and biography, mythology is absurd. Now, these are fighting words in a lot of churches around this community, probably right down the row here somewhere. Talking like that would not be welcomed. Because in many churches in San Diego County, mythology is read literally. These folks are creationists. They argue that Christ is actually God and you're not, and that he literally died and rose from the tomb, and so on and so on and so on. The challenge for all of us as we navigate our own spiritual unfolding is to examine our relationship to these metaphors. Are we okay with thinking of them as metaphors? That's not okay in a lot of communities. And it's a challenge. We're not spinning new dogma here, demanding your assent. This is an inquiry. That's all. Each of us trusts our own inner authority and the unimpeachable experience of our inner awareness. But these are crucial questions to break down confusion. So the purpose of myth, the purpose of our thinking about God, is to throw us out of our domestic associations, out of our normal everyday way of thinking, out of our everyday normal thought realm, and into the boundless mystery that we are. Look, when we go around the world, we recognize all over the place something called the Supreme Being archetype. An archetype is a universal idea found everywhere that gets clothed differently in local areas as slightly variant things. But underneath the local variations, there's this single universal idea called the Supreme Being archetype. All over the world, there's this notion that there is a plane of reality that is hidden from us by the visible plane. And that hidden plane of reality is understood as being the source of the visible plane. That idea is universal, that there is a hidden plane of reality that is superior to and the source of the visible plane of reality. That seems to well up, Jung and Campbell argue, out of something they call the collective unconscious. It just shows up everywhere, all the time, in all cultures that had no contact with each other. And then different people dress up that hidden reality in different ideas, in different concepts. We conceptualize that invisible plane, that ultimate reality that is beyond even the concept of ultimate reality. We dress it up in ideas. We call it something. We give it a name. Some cultures even personify it. They attribute to it human, anthropomorphic, personal characteristics, a gender even, or specific attributes, kind of a grumpy judgmentalness, or a all-forgiving loving kindness. Those are qualities that we attribute to that which is beyond all qualities. These are the masks and God ideas, the names of God. But there's a challenge that we recognize when we do that the more we define God, the more specific we get about his, her, or its attributes, the more the boundless mystery recedes from us. The more specific we get, maybe the more we lose touch with what it is. Let's talk about three big words that you've probably heard: omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence. These are in Western theology, these are the qualities of the Judeo-Christian God. Omniscience means all-knowing, that this being is aware of everything, including the entire future. This being, God, is also omnipotent, limitless in his power, and also omnibenevolent, perfect and good and boundless in his goodness. So in classic Christian and Jewish and Islamic theology, God is given those three attributes: omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence. And then guess what happens? You have this thing well up called the problem of evil. Because if God is all-knowing and limitless in his power and perfectly good, how could there be evil in the world? He knows about it. He could stop it. So he's choosing not to? And then he's not so good? This is not an atheist critique of God. This is an internal memo inside of Christian theology. Thomas Aquinas and others wrestle with this paradox. There is evil in the world, and yet God could stop it. He knows about it, and if he's good, he would stop it. That's a paradox. That doesn't make sense. And you try to pose certain, God allows there to be evil because he wants there to be free will. And many heroic people have tried to settle this paradox, and all have come short. So here's maybe a different way of approaching that. That when we overly conceptualize God, we generate paradoxes. That what if, quote unquote, God is simply the name that we give to this nameless, sacred, formless ground of being from which all forms arise and to which all forms return? What if it is just the singularity of all that is, as Ernest Holmes taught? And that the unity of God, the oneness of the principle of God, like white light through a prism, splits into many color bands. What if human consciousness is like that prism, and the unity of the non-dual reality passing through human consciousness splits up into multiplicity, into paradoxes, into contradictory principles? What if human consciousness is generating these paradoxes that aren't real? So normal conceptual thinking, what the Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna calls ordinary knowledge, cannot know the fullness of ultimate reality. Ordinary knowledge is great. It's fantastic. Look at all the wonders that we have wrought with our intellects and our concepts and our science and our technology and our creativity. All of these concepts and words are wonderful, but there's a sense in which there's a glass ceiling that they cannot penetrate, and ultimate reality is up here. So the way the Buddhist philosophers put it is, ordinary knowledge can never apprehend ultimate reality. But you can pass through that glass ceiling with direct experience, what Nagarjuna calls prajna, or transcendent knowledge. It's what we experience in our meditative states, in our reveries, in our ecstasies. It's what the mystics call oneness. It's not a thought, it's not a concept. And so there's a difference then between knowledge and realization. Knowledge is great, but realization ends up having nothing to do with concepts and thoughts. That goes beyond. Knowing is rooted in words and concepts. Realization is the content-free awareness that I am that. In the medieval Christian tradition, the mystics said, like St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross and the nameless anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing and Meister Eckhart, all these guys talked about you can't describe what God is, you can only say what God is not. In Latin, via negativa. You can only describe what God is not. You cannot put positive attributes on God for the reasons that we're inquiring into right now. And yet that's what we do, and we can playfully do it, and there's nothing wrong with that. Let's talk about some of the names of God. Way back in the time of Moses, a lot of you know this story, of course. In the second book of your Bible, the book of Exodus, we hear the story of Moses, who was alive 1,200 years before Jesus, 3,200 years ago. And when Moses, the book of Exodus tells us, takes the Israelites out of Egyptian bondage across the desert and back to the promised land, he is spurred to that mission by an encounter with God. And God appears to Moses as the burning bush and says to Moses, I need you to go back to Egypt and let my people go. And Moses says, I don't think I can do that. I'm not the right guy for that job. I'm a shepherd, I have a stick. You want me to conquer the biggest military empire in the region with a stick? It's not going to work. And God talks him into it somehow, and Moses says, who should I say sent me? And God gives his name for the first time in the Bible. And that Hebrew word, that famous word, is pronounced in English Yahweh. And is often translated as I am. I am that am. Or in a simpler word, maybe being or existence. So that's a pretty potent name of God. So that was a kind of early name in this Hebrew community. We can't quite call them Jews yet. That word comes up much, much, much later. But in this early budding culture, which will be the source of the Judeo-Christian tradition, that's the first time God gives his name. And then by the 6th century, so like 600 years later, by the time of the Babylonian exile, the name of Yahweh fell out of favor because it was understood as a kind of local, parochial god, a kind of warrior god of a particular tribe. They needed a word that was like bigger. So the word Yahweh kind of fell out of favor and it was replaced by Elohim, meaning God or Lord. And then later still by Adonai, meaning my Lord. So we're getting more and more personal as these names continue to change. So when we move into the Christian period after the time of Jesus, the word Yahweh becomes spelled in Latin with a J, Jehovah, because there's no Y in Latin. And it's finally then just through sloppiness, it begins to be pronounced as a J sound, Jehovah. And then, of course, Jesus becomes associated with God, and that brings a whole other name to God and a whole other set of qualities. But throughout all of these changes of the names of God in just the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's this fundamental baseline thing that persists. This biblical God is an utterly transcendent God, above and outside the world, a little violent, a little gruff, ultimately merciful, not shy about punishment and retribution. In character and temperament, a lot like an ancient tribal warlord. Because that's the God they needed. And we all get the God we need. You gravitate toward the definition and conceptualization of God that you need. If you believe the world is a wicked, evil place in need of fire and brimstone and suffering and punishment, then that's your God. If you gravitate toward the idea that all humanity is a beatific expression of the divine oneness, then that's your God. We gravitate toward the God concept of our liking. That suits our ideology, our temperament. And so how heartbreaking it is that we argue about God, when all we are ever arguing about is about our own limited understanding of that which is boundless, indefinable, and beyond all concepts. Even your most beautiful concepts are partial, provisional, human creations. An attempt to name the colors of the white light that came through the prism of your own consciousness. Beautiful, wonderful, write your hymns, write your poems. All of that is important, as we'll see in a moment. But to claim ultimacy and dogmatic rigidity and literal truthfulness about any of those metaphors is a dangerous step, it seems to me. So turning to India, we find a bewildering array of gods and God concepts. Of course, it's kind of endless over there. They didn't stop with one or even with a trinity. But while there may be hundreds and tens of thousands of gods in India, it's always understood that at the top of the heap is this thing called Brahman, which isn't even a god. Even the most illiterate Indian villager, unschooled villager, understands that in their bhakti, in their devotion to this or that god with their home shrine, understands that all of these gods are simply the faces of the one. They're doing what Catholics are good at doing when they worship God as a trinity. But they also argue that God is a singularity, that Catholics are monotheistic, and that one shows up in three moments, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Well, the Hindus just keep going. They don't go with three. They go to 330,000 or whatever. It's the same principle, that the one can, again, be understood in all of these beautiful, various ways without detracting at all from the non-duality and the singularity of the divine presence, which shows up as all that is, including all of us. So Brahman is the word there, and it's, again, not a personified God. Brahman comes from the Sanskrit root bri, B-H-R-I, which is, and this is, I think, key. Bri means to pour forth, to expand, to emerge. In the same way that your houseplants just sort of grow bigger as you take care of them, and don't if you don't. So there's something in the plant that is just an urge to be more, to know more, to grow more. That is the nature of Brahman. So if everything is an outpouring of Brahman, then that's why you feel this very natural restlessness and urge to know more, to grow more, to be more. This is your sacred unfolding. Don't fight it. Sometimes I think of anxiety as spiritual restlessness. Isn't that a nicer word? Maybe we don't need to medicate it. Maybe we need to cultivate it. Maybe something is growing through us, and naturally growth hurts. It's uncomfortable. Remember when your teeth banged through your gums when you were... No, I don't either. It was so traumatic, we've completely forgotten all of it. Growth hurts because it destroys your current form. And nobody likes their current form even touched, let alone destroyed. So we say we want growth without any change. Good luck with that. When you work that out, call me. We'll put a seminar together and charge $1,500 for the weekend. Growth without change. I already have the website. We'll get rich. So Brahman then in India is the name of that formless sacred ground of being, out of which all forms arise and to which all forms return. Brahman is utterly ineffable. Again, that word ineffable meaning beyond words and concepts. It cannot be reduced to a concept. There's a great 20th century Advaita Vedanta teacher called Nisargadatta Maharaj. He puts it this way in his essential book called I Am That. He puts it this way. He says, the source of consciousness cannot be an object in consciousness. The source of consciousness cannot be an object in consciousness. Let me ask you something right now. Try to see your own eyes without a mirror. You can't see your own eyes because you use your eyes to see. Get it? You can't think about thinking because you use your thinking to think. You can't turn Brahman into a concept because Brahman is your ability to conceptualize. It's like asking a fish, what is water? They're like, what water? What's that? What do you mean? Fish I don't know. I don't talk to fish, but I'm guessing, but some of them are delicious. I'm guessing that fish, I grilled some salmon last night. It was awesome. But I don't think fish know what water is. It's just where they are. It's just what they are. And so when Nisargadatta Maharaj says the source of consciousness cannot be an object in consciousness, he's saying something extremely important about the difficulty we have in conceptualizing ultimate reality, beyond even the concept of ultimate reality. Maybe the best name of God is just like that famous sermon when the Buddha gathered his company together and just held up a flower. Best sermon ever. I was going to do that today, but I thought I'd like to get invited back someday. So, Brahman is the all and everything that is. And all the little bits of stuff, including us, are emanations from that one reality. Therefore, everything is sacred. And here's another interesting thing about how they do it in India. Like I said, there's lots of gods. And it's understood that the gods did not make the world. The gods are part of the created world. It says that in the Rig Veda, probably the most ancient spiritual text on earth, maybe 5,000 years old. It describes the creation coming out of the one, and then it says, the gods are later than this creation. So in many mythologies, in many religious consciousnesses, the gods are not the source of the universe. They are part of the created universe. This might be the biggest difference between Eastern religion and Western religion. That in Judeo-Christian Islam thinking, God is the source of everything, this personified conscious entity. But in India, and in many polytheistic systems, the gods, they just work here. They're part of the created world. So that, again, shifts the whole name of God piece. So the idea of Brahman is echoed, I'll add one more in here. The idea of Brahman is echoed in China by the concept of Tao. And in the Tao Te Ching, again, Lao Tzu begins this classic Chinese book of wisdom with that famous line that I distorted at the beginning. I'll give you the real line. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. So in Chinese, Tao literally means way or path. But like Brahman, Tao is not a personified deity. It's a non-local, if I could borrow that term from quantum physics, it's a non-local event. It's everywhere all the time. It is a process. So Tao is simply the word for the deeply interconnected evolutionary process by which everything emerges. And like Brahman, it's both immanent and transcendent. It's everywhere all the time. It can be found within all of the nature's processes. And yet, this grand concept in Taoism is given such a humble little word, Tao. It just means path or way. That's an interesting name of God. In fact, Tao sounds a lot like, for the Star Wars fans here, it sounds a lot like the Force. And there's a reason for that. When George Lucas wrote those first scripts for those first Star Wars films, he was immersed in a study of Asian philosophy thanks to his friend Joseph Campbell. And so the religion of the Jedi in the Star Wars mythos, the Force, is very much lifted right out of Taoism and Vedanta philosophy. So when you understand the Force, you understand a lot about Taoism and Vedanta. Now, you might find it crass or at best silly to talk about Star Wars in a Sunday service, a concept of fiction. But let's sit with it for a minute. Where do God ideas come from? Where do you think they come from? From God? We've already established that's not likely. God ideas come from us. And who are the people that are always making stuff up? It's the artists. It's the storytellers. It's the painters. It's the singers. It's the dancers. It's the weavers of tales. They're the ones, like George Lucas, who reclothe the ancient perennial wisdom in a new set of particulars. And who's to say 1,000 years from now, people might be watching those Star Wars movies in some sort of a religious community. Now, that sounds ridiculous, right? Or does it? I think it's already happening. Have you been to Comic-Con? It's here. So that's an interesting possibility that if we make the masks, then when you look at something like Star Wars and the way it electrifies generations of people around these ideas, maybe there's something going on there. So there's this great story in the Upanishads. The student asks the master, "How many gods are there?" And the master says, 330,000. The student says, "Okay, among those, how many are there really?" "Well, really, there's 33,000. "Well, among those, how many?" "Well, really, there's 3,300. Those are the real ones." "Well, among those, how many are there really?" "Really, there's just 330. Those are the main ones." So sensing the trend, the student keeps pushing. "How many are there really?" "Well, really, there's just 33. "All right, among the 33, how many are there really?" "Really, there's just 3. And the student says, "Well, among the 3, how many are there really?" And the teacher says, "Really, there's just 1. And the student says, "1? Then why did you tell me there were 330,000? And the teacher says, "Those are merely the many names of the powers of the One." So in this Vedanta or Hindu system, it's understood that God is one, Brahman is one, but shows up as a multiplicity. And there's some comfort with that. So our essential work then, to close, our essential work seems to be to engage with our God concepts fully, with every aspect of our being, all of our love, our heart, our mind, and whatever tools we can muster, and let these masks of eternity do their work. Let them show us where our own ultimacy lay, while remembering always that in the end, the masks and the many names of God are in fact the final obstacles to be overcome. And as I said before, this is in some way the tragedy of our human existence, that all over the world people are fighting because they have different metaphors for the same exact reality. All of the masks, all of the names of God are metaphors, and we get stuck on the metaphors and we forget the deeper reality that they point to. In other words, our God concepts trap us in tribes that war with each other. And if you really want to know God, you have to forget everything you know about God. This is what the great Christian mystics call the cloud of unknowing. To leave behind ideology, leave behind conceptualization, leave behind all stale consciousness of separateness and division, and enter into that unified field. So these insights that we've been thinking about this morning, they call us. They call us to come out of our conceptual thinking, out of our little tents and little camps, little encampments. And to come out into a field of direct, unmediated being, a place beyond all names, all masks, all concepts. Meditation can help us do this, because in meditation we practice falling quiet and coming out of the conceptual stream. And all the other spiritual practices help us do this too. Worship and study and sacred service. All of these are valid means to the end. The realization that is through our sacred practices that the immediacy of our own ultimacy is finally fully realized. As we know, so are we known. The rest of that Nisargadatta Maharaj quote, I'll give you the second half now. It starts, the source of consciousness cannot be an object in consciousness. And then he adds, to know the source is to be the source. This is what it means to realize, to make real, to embody, to have our being there as Jesus had his being there. And not merely to mouth the words of the ancients, but dare to live that wisdom and dare to become what they became, dare to become ourselves, our true selves. For finally, our name too is one of the many names of God. Namaste.